Listen, there might be this guy that you draft middle to late rounds that seems super insignificant at the time. But when the season rolls around and things go haywire as they're known to do in football, you might be holding on to some gold. So who are some sleepers in 2023 that have some huge upside? Let's dive into it. Headliner Nation, I've got a few guys I want to talk about today that if things go right for them and maybe potentially wrong for somebody else, they could provide your fantasy team with some high upside. Now, none of these guys may be fantasy viable right away, and some of them may be better suited for like a best ball league, but every single one of them should be on our radar. But before we hop into that, I need to announce the winner of one of our biggest giveaways ever. Last week, I told people that if you headed on over to Underdog and you signed up and deposited at least $10 by using code word headliners, we were gonna put you in a drawing to take on a $500 entry fee tournament with myself, and I'm covering the entry fee. And after randomizing all of the names for the people that we have had sign up since we partnered up with Underdog, we have our winner for this awesome opportunity. So congratulations to James Dennison, who's going to be drafting in this Underdog tournament with myself. I'm covering the $500 entry fee, and if we take home the first place prize of $100,000, James and I are gonna split it down the middle. But that doesn't mean if you sign up with Underdog now that you don't have some awesome opportunities for stuff, because if you deposit 10 bucks, you're gonna get a free draft guide still, which I know some of you could use. And by the way, you could still potentially pick out something from Jake's office too. So use that code word headliners when you make an account and you deposit your $10. We'll make sure that we get you that draft guide right away. And if we choose you to also pick out something from Jake's office, we'll make sure to announce that winner coming up soon. But for now, let's go ahead and jump into the players. And the first guy I want to talk about is a guy that I loved coming out of the draft, but hated the situation he fell into. But some things have actually gone his way recently. It's Marvin MMs from Denver. Now, Marvin MMs has huge big play upside, but this was the depth chart that was absolutely filled to the top with wide receivers. But Tim Patrick has gone down for the season with an injury, and KJ Hamler, who had a heart condition pop up, was recently released. Now, KJ Hamler was the guy that really could potentially fill that deep role for Denver this year, but they might not even bring him back. There is a possibility when he clears up that they do bring him back later in the season, but for now, this is Marvin Mims' job to lose, is the wide receiver 3 now in Denver. And maybe you don't know a whole lot about Marvin Mims, but coming out of Oklahoma, he was one of the best deep play threats in all of football at the wide receiver position. He was the only FBS wide receiver to have at least 45 receptions and average over 20 yards per reception. And there's a lot of people that feel like Russell Wilson may be washed up. But even with that being the case, last year in what was probably his worst career season so far, he actually still went down the field on a pretty consistent basis. When looking at targets that went 20 or more yards down the field last year, Russell Wilson ranked second in yards and third in attempts. And yeah, he'll have a different offensive scheme now, and Marvin Mims is still gonna have to fight for targets with either Jerry Jeudy or Cortland Sutton. But if there is any type of an injury to either Jeudy or Sutton, or who knows, there was a lot of talk about one of these guys being traded. Maybe one is traded in season. Marvin Mims becomes the wide receiver 2 and potential number 2 target on an offense that plays out in the AFC West, where everybody's gonna be throwing it. So for your redraft leagues, maybe he's not a guy that gives you a ton of value right away, but maybe he's a guy that could spot start as like a wide receiver 3 in really good matchups. And for best ball leagues, obviously you draft this guy super late, and if he goes off and has a game-winning week, he's gonna be in your lineup anyway. Keep an eye on Marvin Mims. Let's keep going at the wide receiver position, talking about upside, because quite honestly, the wide receiver position is the best position to find high upside at later in your draft. And a guy that a lot of people liked coming into this season that had some decent performances last year was Rasheed Shaheed. Now, with Michael Thomas being currently healthy and Alvin Kamara only missing 3 games to start the season, Shaheed is going to kind of be on the back burner, but he should still start in 3 wide receiver sets. And last season, he was a big deep play threat, and now he's going to be getting a quarterback that was one of the best at going down the field last year. Shaheed averaged over 14 yards per target, which was first in the NFL. He was 8th in yards per reception, and he was 13th in yards after the catch per reception too. His 4 receptions of 40 or more yards last year, which was tied for 10th in the NFL, was actually tied for 10th with his teammate Chris Olave. And here we go. Let's talk about those targets of 20 or more yards down the field, because even though Shaheed didn't have a whole lot of them last year, his efficiency on them went really well. On targets of 20 or more yards down the field last season, Shaheed was 7th in yards per reception, 6th in yards after the catch per reception, and he was 1st in yards per route run, averaging over 40 yards. Now, once again, is this a guy that we draft in like a 12-team league to start right away? Absolutely not. But he could potentially be a bench stash, definitely a best ball stash. And if you're somebody out there that finds themselves in like 14 to 16 man leagues, he's a guy that we should take a shot on as well. If anything happens to Chris Olave, then he automatically becomes the deep threat on the team. If anything happens to Michael Thomas, he becomes the number 2 target on the team. And like I said, people hate Derek Carr and they don't think that he's a good quarterback. But last year, he was actually one of the best quarterbacks 20 or more yards down the field. Shaheed fits perfectly with what Derek Carr does very well. He might help some people this season. All right, I've got a couple of running backs that we're really going to need to stash because if things go right, they're going to have tons of upside. But I've got one more wide receiver to talk about, and hopefully I don't lose you on this one because you all know Gabe Davis is coming up in this video. Listen, he was definitely not as consistent as we would have liked last season. And some of these guys that we take a look at in terms of big playability down the field, they aren't the most consistent players, but that doesn't mean that we should just forget about them. Heck, for several years, Tyler Lockett was one of the most inconsistent players in all of football and still finished as a top fantasy option. It can be a little upsetting though, trying to figure out what weeks will work best for these players and making sure they're in our lineup instead of on our bench. And even with the inconsistencies that Gabe Davis had last season, Josh Allen was still one of the top passers in all of football when it came to targets of 20 or more yards down the field. He was 1st in yards and 2nd in attempts on those passes. I think you also really need to take into perspective how last season went for Gabe Davis and Josh Allen. Gabe Davis had a huge week 1, but then in practice prior to week 2, hurt his ankle and missed week 2. And then after that, for weeks 3 and 4, he still was not 100%. So a great performance to start the year, then a missed game, and then 2 weeks of not being 100% again. But then once he got back to feeling better, he looked a lot different in weeks 5 and 6, going for 171 yards and 2 touchdowns in week 5. Then followed it up with 74 yards and a touchdown in week 6. Now the rest of the season also brought some inconsistencies, but one of the reasons that brought some inconsistencies was the elbow injury to Josh Allen. He just didn't throw the ball down the field with enough consistent accuracy to really help out Gabe Davis. Now, Davis did still have a big game the week after Josh Allen injured his elbow, but for the rest of the season, you could see on tape that that connection just wasn't what it was earlier in the year. Now that Josh Allen is healed up, hopefully Gabe Davis is 100% healthy as well. This is an offense that maybe Gabe Davis does not see the volume that we would like. But when you've got a threat out of the backfield like James Cook, you drafted Dalton Kincaid to absolutely hammer over the middle of the field, and you got one of the best, most respected wide receivers in all of football, Stephon Diggs, on the other side, Gabe Davis is going to have a ton of one-on-one matchups. And quite honestly, it may only take 3 or 4 targets per game to make Gabe Davis what you would need. Now in redraft leagues, if you don't want to deal with the headache, then just skip over the top of him. But I can tell you right now, in best ball leagues, you absolutely should have as many Gabe Davis shares as possible. And in redraft leagues, if you want to risk it, go for it. We'll just hope that the consistencies stay a little bit better this season. All right, enough of the wide receivers. Let's talk about a couple of running backs that you really need to have handcuffed in your leagues. And one of the biggest travesties of the entire offseason was the Atlanta Falcons drafting Bijan Robinson, because Tyler Algier was in line for a huge season. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. If the Falcons had not drafted Bijan Robinson, Algier likely would have been a top 12 running back for me. Tyler Algier was absolutely insane when it came to efficiency last season. He was 8th in yards after contact, and he was 5th in yards after contact per attempt. He also forced 51 missed tackles, which was 8th. Then he was 9th in runs of 15 or more yards and 11th in total yards on runs of 15 or more yards. And by the way, he did all of that by facing 8 or more defenders in the box on 40% of his running plays. The highest percentage in all of football, and it wasn't close. And yes, Bijan Robinson is going to be the RB1 there. There is absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. And Bijan Robinson, even with Tyler Algier behind him, still has top 5 running back potential. But with as good as Tyler Algier was last year, how do you not utilize him in some capacity? And with as much as the Atlanta Falcons are still going to run the football, does it make sense to draft Tyler Algier even if you don't have Bijan Robinson? I mean, how many backfields have we seen before where they've had 2 running backs be fantasy viable? Let's say Bijan Robinson is a running back in the 5 to 10 range. That doesn't mean that Tyler Algier still couldn't put together top 36 numbers at the position. So even if you don't own Bijan Robinson, I would likely still grab Tyler Algier at some point in your draft. And if you own Bijan Robinson, you absolutely must draft Tyler Algier. Because if anything happens to Bijan where he's either limited or misses weeks, Tyler Algier is going to be a borderline running back 1. And I'm not wishing any ill on Bijan Robinson, but we all know that injuries happen and we have to prepare for the worst regardless of the player. And in best ball leagues, you absolutely should also be drafting Tyler Algier, because once again, if something were to happen, you want him. But what if we have a game where he breaks off a couple of big runs for like a 60-yard touchdown or something? That's going to be a fantasy viable performance for the week, and he could go into your lineup as a flex option. Let's not forget Tyler Algier, even though the hype around Bijan Robinson is absolutely insane. I've got another backup running back as well that I'm coming around to a lot more, and his name is Jalen Warren. Now, are his overall stats from last year that good? Absolutely not. This past week, he did have a huge 60-yard touchdown run, but he was definitely more efficient than Najee Harris was last season. Do we see Jalen Warren push him for playing time? Warren almost averaged 5 yards per attempt last season, and he was also tied for 6 in avoided tackles per attempt. And even though he didn't have the biggest box score numbers when it came to receiving, when you take a look at Pro Football Focus, which sometimes you have to take these things with a grain of salt, his receiving grade was 3rd highest among wide receivers, behind only Christian McCaffrey and Antonio Gibson. So there is going to be an opportunity for Jalen Warren to help in the passing game a little bit more, because Najee Harris at this point, just on an efficiency level, isn't quite getting it done. Now, does that mean Harris is going to lose his job? Absolutely not, because he's been good enough to keep it. But we're missing some ceiling with him. So if we can get Jalen Warren going and he's got some big play potential on passing plays, that's great. Also, Jalen Warren is one of the highest graded running back blockers on passing attempts in all the NFL. So on 3rd down or long down situations, I think we're going to be seeing some more of Jalen Warren as well. And the more opportunities you get on the football field, the more opportunities you have to touch the football. But not only that, in terms of efficiency, last season, Warren finished ahead of Najee Harris in several categories, including yards after contact per attempt and avoided tackle rate. He also finished higher in explosive run rate, and he also finished higher in negative run rate and success rate. All of those per CBS Sports. So yes, if Najee Harris goes down with an injury, or the dude just isn't good to begin the season, you might have some fire when it comes to Jalen Warren. And given all the pass catchers that they have there, the upgrades that they've made to the offensive line, and Darnell Washington being like essentially an extra blocker as well, if Jalen Warren gets a hole, oh baby, he's going fast. But Headliner Nation, again, none of these guys are somebody that you're gonna draft right now and say to yourself, he's gonna help me win a fantasy championship. But all of these guys have the potential to help you win a fantasy championship if some things go right. So let me know down in the comments below, who is somebody to you that you feel has a ton of upside potential, even though they may not have the best situation right now. And also, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and stick around for all of the rest of the off-season content that we have coming. And of course, the season is almost here. And everybody watching the video should be hitting the like button, and everybody should be commenting down below. Headliner Nation, I appreciate you all. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.